A CEO millionaire, had all the money and power in the world, except the one thing he couldn't have: a child. A cold marriage contract with a woman who had nothing left to lose seemed like the perfect solution, until everything spiraled out of control. Madison had once thought that leaving the cold city sidewalks and stepping into a luxurious mansion would make her feel safe, or at least less unsteady. But now, standing in a vast space with pristine white walls and long silk curtains cascading like waterfalls, she realized she had never felt so alone. The room assigned to her wasn't just any room. It was larger than any place she'd ever lived. A king-sized bed with crisp white linens, a balcony overlooking a garden bursting with vibrant flowers, and a bathroom so lavish it took her several minutes to figure out how to turn on the faucet. Everything was perfect, but it was too perfect, lacking any trace of humanity. Madison sank into an armchair by the window, her fingers absently brushing the soft velvet fabric. Everything here was refined, expensive, and utterly foreign to her. She knew why she was here. A deal. Ethan had kept his promise. He hadn't left her wandering the streets or sleeping under the awning of some rundown cafe. Instead, he'd brought her here, into a completely different world. But Ethan Carter wasn't here. The moment he dropped her off at the mansion, he'd all but disappeared. She'd only met Stephanie, his assistant, who handled everything related to her. "If you need anything, just let me know," Stephanie had said with a professional smile, though her eyes remained distant. It was as if she were speaking to an object, not a person. Madison nodded without saying more. The first few days passed quietly. Ethan didn't show up. He was probably buried in work, or simply didn't care about the woman carrying his child. Breakfast was served on time, exquisite dishes were laid out on a grand, ornate table, but Madison just sat there, staring at the plate as if it belonged to someone else. Dinner was the same. She ate alone in the silent room, the faint clink of cutlery against porcelain the only sound, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of emptiness. She didn't belong here. The mansion's staff never met her eyes. They performed their duties with professional courtesy, but kept their distance. No one spoke to her. No one cared about her as a real person. Everything felt mechanical. One evening, Madison wandered through the mansion. She roamed down long hallways where chandelier light reflected off polished marble floors. Every door was shut tight, as if hiding secrets she wasn't allowed to touch. Finally, she stepped into the garden. It was peaceful, but also painfully lonely. She sat on a wooden bench, gazing up at the star-filled sky. She remembered those freezing winter nights, curled up on the streets, hoping for a miracle, something to pull her out of the pit of poverty and despair. And now, she had it. But Madison wasn't sure if this was a miracle or just another kind of prison. She'd traded her freedom for a place of safety, but in return, she'd become part of Ethan Carter's plan. She was no longer Madison Brooks. She was just someone fulfilling a deal. She wondered if Ethan ever thought about her, or if he simply saw her as a step in his production line, a vessel for his child, nothing more. And then, as she was lost in those thoughts, a low voice cut through the silence. "You're still awake?" Madison startled and turned around. Ethan stood there, just a few steps away. The garden lights glinted off his sharp black suit, highlighting his almost unreal perfection. She didn't know how to respond. She hadn't expected him to appear. He studied her for a moment before slowly walking over and sitting on the bench across from her. "What do you think of this place?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with a chill. Madison gave a wry smile. "It's too big, too quiet, and too empty." Ethan didn't seem surprised by her answer. He just looked up at the sky, as if weighing something. "I don't need it to be warm, I just need it to be efficient." Madison raised an eyebrow. "Efficient?" He turned to her, his gray eyes glinting with resolve. "Everything in my life is planned. I don't let emotions interfere." She let out a small, mocking laugh. "And what about me? I'm part of that plan too, right?" Ethan didn't deny it. "Yes, but that doesn't mean you can't live comfortably." Madison tilted her head, studying the man before her. "Really? Then why do I feel like a bird trapped in a golden cage?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. The night breeze blew through, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. "You're here for a reason, and when it's over, you'll have everything you need to start again." "This isn't a prison, Madison. It's an opportunity." Madison stared at him for a long time. There was no pity in his eyes, no emotion, just the certainty of a man who always controlled everything. But there was one thing he didn't understand. Some things couldn't be bought with money, and some kinds of loneliness couldn't be filled with luxury. She took a deep breath and stood up. "If you say so." She walked toward the door but paused before going inside, turning to look at Ethan one last time. "But you're wrong, Ethan." He raised an eyebrow. "This isn't an opportunity. It's just another way to lose myself." And with that, she walked away, leaving Ethan alone in the darkness with thoughts even he couldn't control. Ethan Carter had never felt nervous in his 36 years of life. He had orchestrated billion-dollar deals, faced down enemies in the business world, and even navigated legal battles that could have destroyed his career. But that morning, as he stood in front of the obstetric clinic's door, for the first time in his life, he felt uneasy. Madison walked slowly into the waiting room, her slender frame accentuated by the loose dress that swayed with each step. She didn't seem overly emotional, but her eyes, those same green eyes, held a guardedness, as if she were used to facing the world alone without anyone by her side. Ethan followed her, hands in his pockets, his face as cold as ever. He had no real reason to accompany her here. It was part of the agreement. She carried the child. He ensured everything went smoothly. But when Stephanie had mentioned Madison's prenatal checkup that morning, Ethan had decided to come along himself, offering no explanation. The nurse smiled as she led Madison into the ultrasound room. Ethan followed, standing in a corner, his eyes scanning everything with cautious detachment. He didn't like places like this. The smell of antiseptic, the white walls, the hushed murmurs of doctors and patients, it all stirred an unfamiliar discomfort in him. Madison lay on the examination bed, lifting her shirt to reveal a still flat stomach, though inside it, a life was growing. The doctor applied gel to her skin and pressed the ultrasound wand against her belly, eyes fixed on the screen, and then the sound came. A heartbeat, not Madison's, the child's. Ethan's head snapped up, his entire body freezing. The thump, thump, thump echoed powerfully, faster than a normal heartbeat, yet brimming with life. He had thought this would be unremarkable. He had assumed he'd stand there, listen to the doctor rattle off statistics, and return to his usual routine as if nothing had happened. But when he heard that heartbeat, a completely foreign sensation crashed into his chest. Ethan didn't know how to describe it. It wasn't fear, nor was it confusion. It was a connection. For the first time, he didn't see Madison as just part of the deal. He didn't view her flat stomach as merely a process underway. He saw a person, a life, something that belonged to him. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath until the doctor turned to him with a smile. "Everything looks great. The baby's developing well." Ethan only nodded. He couldn't find words. Madison glanced at him, noticing something different in his gaze. For the first time since they'd met, Ethan Carter wasn't in control of his emotions. He was feeling. On the drive back to the mansion, neither spoke. Madison stared out the car window, the morning sunlight illuminating the contours of her face. But instead of relief, she felt unease. Ethan wasn't himself. He didn't flip open his laptop as usual, didn't check emails, didn't offer his typical cold remarks like, "Everything's fine, that's what matters." He just sat there, staring out the window, though it was clear he wasn't really looking at anything. Finally, Madison broke the silence. "Are you okay?" Ethan flinched slightly, turning to her. It might have been the first time she'd ever asked him that. He didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if he was okay. He didn't know why a heartbeat could shake him so deeply. He didn't know why at this moment a storm seemed to be churning inside him. Finally, he replied slowly, "Everything's going according to plan." Madison let out a soft laugh. a faint sound laced with mockery. "Really? Then why do you look like someone just threw you into the water and you forgot how to swim?" Ethan didn't respond, but as Madison turned away, he looked at her, and for the first time he wondered if everything was truly just a plan. That evening, when they returned to the mansion, Madison went to her room first, but Ethan didn't head to his office as he usually did. Instead, he climbed to the second floor and stopped in front of a locked room, a room he hadn't opened in years. The key was in his pocket. His hand brushed against it, but he didn't pull it out. He wasn't sure he was ready to face what lay behind that door. It had been his mother's room. She used to sit there for hours, telling him stories about when he was little, stories he'd long tried to forget. But tonight, as he rested his hand on the doorknob, he realized something. He couldn't keep denying this anymore. This room, his past, the emotions he'd tried to suppress, they were all coming back, and it had all started with something small. A heartbeat. Madison hated mornings. It wasn't because she disliked the sunlight filtering through the curtains or the faint smell of coffee wafting through the mansion. It was because every morning she had to face herself in the mirror, a Madison Brooks who felt like a stranger, caught between two worlds, no longer the homeless girl sleeping under a cafe awning, but not truly a part of this place either, just suspended, belonging nowhere. She sat on the bed, her hand lightly brushing her stomach. 2 months had passed. Though her belly wasn't yet noticeably larger, she could feel the changes in her body, the lingering fatigue, the dull ache in her back, and above all, the loneliness that never left. Stephanie had arranged everything perfectly. A diet, doctor's appointments, even relaxation activities Madison didn't bother with. But Ethan remained a ghost. He appeared only when necessary, as if she were just a cog in the methodical plan he was executing. Madison had once thought it didn't bother her, but with each passing day, the silence of the mansion tightened around her, making her feel like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. And perhaps that was why she hadn't slept at all last night. That morning, Madison dragged herself out of bed with a back so sore she winced. Lack of sleep, a mattress too soft, or maybe just a reminder that she was slowly changing. She shuffled to the dining room. Breakfast was meticulously laid out on the table. Crisp toast, golden scrambled eggs, a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. But she didn't want to eat. She just sat there, chin resting on her hand, staring out the window, lost in thought. And then something unexpected happened. When Madison returned to her room, she noticed something different. The pillows on her bed had been replaced. The old ones, slightly stiff and uncomfortable, were gone, swapped for a new set, softer, thicker. A thicker blanket was also neatly placed on the chair, folded perfectly, as if it had always been there. But it hadn't. Madison frowned, stepping toward the bed and picking up a pillow, feeling the difference in the fabric, and then she saw it. A small piece of paper, folded in half, placed neatly on the bedside table. The handwriting was clean, strong, without a single unnecessary stroke. "So you can sleep better." No signature, but she knew who it was from. Madison blinked, a strange feeling rising in her chest. Ethan. No explanation, no empty pleasantries, just a short note. She didn't know what to make of it. He didn't have to do this. He could have ignored her, as he always did. She was just a part of this contract, a woman carrying his child, nothing more. But this was something else. She wasn't sure what it was, but one thing she knew for certain. Ethan Carter wasn't the type to do anything without a reason. That evening, as Madison sat on the balcony with the new blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she heard footsteps. She didn't turn around, but the familiar low voice spoke from behind her. "Are you more comfortable now?" Madison tightened her grip on the blanket. She didn't answer right away, just quietly turned her head, looking at Ethan through the dim glow of the garden lights. He stood there, tall and imposing, still in his pristine dress shirt despite the late hour. His face didn't show much, but there was something in his eyes, a faint but unmistakable hint of concern. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but tinged with mockery. "I didn't know Ethan Carter cared about things like pillows and blankets." He shrugged, as if it were no big deal. I care about efficiency. If you sleep better, you'll feel better, and if you feel better, the pregnancy will go smoother. Madison gave a small laugh, though it wasn't out of amusement. So it's all just part of your plan? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, then stepped forward, resting his hands on the balcony railing, his gaze drifting into the dark void beyond. I don't know, just 3 words, but they caught Madison off guard. For the first time, he didn't have a perfect answer. She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with curiosity. You don't know? I thought you had everything planned out. Ethan took a deep breath. I'm still trying to figure this out. Madison studied him. The breeze blew through, lifting her hair slightly, but she didn't take her eyes off him. This, he turned to her, his silver-gray eyes meeting her vivid green ones, and for a fleeting moment there was no contract, no deal, just 2 people standing in the night facing something neither could yet name. Finally, Madison gave a faint smile. Whatever your reason, thanks for the pillow. Ethan looked at her a moment longer, then nodded. Good night, Madison. He turned and walked back toward the long hallway, his figure gradually fading into the golden light. Madison stayed on the balcony, her thoughts a tangled mess. Ethan Carter wasn't the type to show care, but tonight he had, without even realizing it, and perhaps that was the most frightening thing of all. Madison didn't know why she felt so anxious. It wasn't her first time at the clinic. The routine checkups had been part of the contract, and so far everything had been fine. But that morning, as she stepped into the sleek luxury car waiting outside the mansion, her heart beat faster than usual. Something wasn't right. Ethan, as always, sat beside her in the back seat. He said nothing, his eyes glued to his phone screen, fingers scrolling through text with calm precision. If he sensed anything unusual, he didn't show it, but Madison knew, she felt it. The car pulled up to the clinic and she stepped out, hesitating as a fleeting wave of dizziness washed over her. Ethan noticed, even though she hadn't said a word. Are you okay? He asked, his voice steady but laced with a subtle concern. Madison nodded, reassuring herself. Just a little tired this morning. Ethan didn't reply, but as she walked inside, he stayed by her side. Unlike before when he'd let her go alone. The doctor smiled as he entered the examination room. We'll check on the baby's development today. Any questions from either of you? Madison shook her head. Ethan just stood there, hands in his pockets, his familiar cold expression in place, but his gaze didn't stray from the ultrasound monitor. The doctor applied cool gel to Madison's stomach and pressed the wand against her skin. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the familiar sound came. Thump, thump, thump. A heartbeat. But this time it wasn't just 1. It was 2. Madison didn't register it immediately, but the doctor did. He raised an eyebrow slightly, his eyes focused on the screen. She swallowed hard. Was something wrong? Ethan noticed the shift in the doctor's demeanor. He stepped closer, his voice sharper than usual. Is there a problem? The doctor turned to them, offering a gentle smile. No problem at all, but there's something we didn't catch in the last ultrasound. He rotated the screen so Madison and Ethan could see. There on the display were not 1, but 2 tiny glowing dots. 2 heartbeats. Madison felt her breath catch in her throat. 2, not 1 child, but 2, the doctor smiled. Congratulations to you both. Madison is carrying twins. The room seemed to freeze. Madison blinked, trying to process what she'd just heard. But it was Ethan's reaction that stunned her even more. He stood still, completely silent. The man who always had an answer. The man who stayed calm in every situation. The man who never let a single emotion slip. Now he stood there, staring at the screen as if the world had just tilted in a direction he couldn't control. Madison didn't know what to say. She just looked at him, waiting. Finally, after a silence so long she could almost hear her own blood rushing in her ears, Ethan spoke. His voice was soft, but sharp. 2? The doctor nodded. Yes. Both are healthy. "This is good news." But Ethan didn't respond. He just stood there, as if he'd been thrust into a reality he hadn't prepared for. Madison tightened her grip on her stomach, a strange sensation spreading through her. She knew, in that moment, everything had changed. On the drive back to the mansion, neither spoke. Madison leaned her head against the car window, staring out, but her mind was spinning. Twins. It wasn't part of the plan, not Ethan's plan, not her plan. She glanced at him. He sat motionless, eyes fixed ahead, but his hand on his thigh clenched slightly. What was he thinking? She couldn't stand the silence any longer. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Ethan didn't turn to her. The question should be, what are we going to do? Madison raised an eyebrow. Had he just said we? Ethan Carter, the man who drew clear lines between everything, had just included her in his equation? What the hell was happening? She laughed, but there was no joy in it. "You're seriously thinking about we? Because I thought to you this was just a contract." Ethan stayed silent for a long time. Then he turned to look at her. This time there was something different in his eyes, not cold, not distant, but hesitant. "I thought so too," he said slowly, "but now I'm not sure." Madison froze. He wasn't sure. This was Ethan Carter, the man who was certain of everything, who always had an answer to every problem. And now he wasn't sure. Somehow that scared her more than the fact she was carrying twins. Because if Ethan Carter couldn't control this, then she couldn't control her own emotions anymore either. Madison hadn't thought this day would come so soon. She'd told herself hundreds of times that she was prepared, that she knew her role, that this was just an agreement, a contract with clear terms. But as she stood in the empty room, her suitcase packed, the ticking of the clock on the wall echoing like the beat of a breaking heart, she realized she'd never truly been ready. Today, she was leaving the mansion, leaving the 2 children she'd carried in her womb for 9 months, leaving the man she'd tried so hard not to love and failed. She gripped the suitcase handle tightly, feeling her nails dig into her skin. Part of her wanted to turn away, to vanish before this moment became too painful. But as she descended the stairs, Ethan was there. He wasn't wearing his usual pristine suit. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and for the first time, he didn't look like the man who controlled the world. He looked lost. Their eyes met, and in that moment no words were needed, but Madison knew she couldn't wait. If she paused, if she looked at him too long, she'd never be able to leave. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Everything's ready, I'll go now." Ethan didn't react immediately, but his eyes said everything. He didn't want her to go. Madison gave a faint, pained smile, trying to hide the ache. "We both knew this was the plan from the start. You got what you wanted, and so did I. The deal's done." A minute passed in silence. Then Ethan let out a slow breath and tore the contract to pieces right in front of her. Ripped into shreds. The scraps of paper fell to the floor like autumn leaves, and Madison couldn't believe her eyes. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Her voice trembled. He stepped closer, his silver-gray eyes blazing with something she'd never seen before. Fear. But not the fear of losing control, the fear of losing her. "I don't care about the contract anymore, Madison," he said, his voice low and hoarse as if each word was a struggle to speak. "I don't care about my original plan. There's only one thing I care about." She shook her head, stepping back. She couldn't hear this. She couldn't. "And what's that?" Ethan stopped, his gaze locked on hers. "You." Madison's heart seemed to stop. She didn't know how long she'd secretly hoped for this, but now, hearing it, she was more afraid than ever. "Ethan," she whispered, but he took another step, closing the distance between them until it was just a breath. "I thought I could live my whole life without needing anyone," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I thought love was weakness, an unnecessary tether." He paused, as if choosing his words with care. But then you came along, and everything I thought I knew was wrong." Madison closed her eyes. She wanted to believe him, but how could she? She'd spent her whole life believing she wasn't worth keeping. "You'll change your mind, Ethan," she said, her voice shaking. "One day you'll wake up and realize this was just a moment of weakness." He shook his head, unwavering. "No, not weakness, awakening." Madison felt her chest tighten. She'd spent her life running, but for the first time, someone wasn't letting her run anymore. She bit her lip, tears spilling over, but she didn't care. "Are you sure?" Ethan reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I've never been more sure. And if you need time to trust me, I'll wait." The next morning, Madison didn't leave. She stood on the balcony, watching the sun rise through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel lost. She heard footsteps behind her, then felt the familiar warmth as Ethan stood beside her. "You never asked me," Madison said softly, "if I wanted to stay." Ethan gave a rare, faint smile, one she'd seldom seen. "Because I wanted it to be your choice." Madison turned to him, and then she took his hand. "Then I choose to stay." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his eyes lighting up with something she'd never seen before. Genuine happiness, not because of a contract, not out of duty, but because of love. And for Madison, that was worth more than anything.